A Rendezvous in Averoigne by Clark Ashton Smith. Chapter 1. Gerard de l'Automne was meditating the rhymes of a new ballade in honor of Fleurette as he followed the leaf-erased pathway toward Vions through the woodland of Averoigne. Since he was on his way to meet Fleurette, who had promised to keep a rendezvous among the oaks and beeches like any peasant girl, Gerard himself made better progress than the ballade. His love was at that stage which, even for a professional troubadour, is more productive of distraction than inspiration, and he was recurrently absorbed in a meditation upon other than merely verbal felicities. The grass and trees had assumed the fresh enamel of a medieval May. The turf was figured with little blossoms of azure and white and yellow, like an ornate broidery, and there was a pebbly stream that murmured beside the way, as if the voices of undines were parleying deliciously beneath its waters. The sun-lulled air was laden with a wafture of youth and romance, and the longing that welled from the heart of Gerard seemed to mingle mystically with the balsams of the wood. Gerard was a trouvère whose scant years and many wanderings had brought him a certain renown. After the fashion of his kind, he had roamed from court to court, from chateau to chateau, and he was now the guest of the Comte de la Frenay, whose high castle held dominion over half the surrounding forest. Visiting one day that quaint cathedral town, Vions, which lies so near to the ancient wood of Averoigne, Gerard had seen Fleurette, the daughter of a well-to-do mercer named Guillaume Cochin, and had become more sincerely enamored of her blonde piquancy than was to be expected from one who had been so frequently susceptible in such matters. He had managed to make his feelings known to her, and after a month of billets doux, ballades, and stolen interviews contrived by the help of a complaisant waiting woman, she had made this woodland tryst with him in the absence of her father from Vions. Accompanied by her maid and a manservant, she was to leave the town early that afternoon and meet Gerard under a certain beech tree of enormous age and size. The servants would then withdraw discreetly, and the lovers, to all intents and purposes, would be alone. It was not likely that they would be seen or interrupted, for the gnarled and immemorial wood possessed an ill repute among the peasantry. Somewhere in this wood there was the ruinous and haunted Château de Fosses Flammes, and also there was a double tomb, within which the Sieur Hugh du Malembois and his châtelaine, who were notorious for sorcery in their time, had lain unconsecrated for more than 200 years. Of these and their phantoms, there were grisly tales, and there were stories of loup-garous and goblins, of fays and devils and vampires that infested Averoigne. But to these tales Gerard had given little heed, considering it improbable that such creatures would fare abroad in open daylight. The madcap Fleurette had professed herself unafraid also, but it had been necessary to promise the servants a substantial pourboire, since they shared fully the local superstitions. Gerard had wholly forgotten the legendary of Averoigne as he hastened along the sun-flecked path. He was nearing the appointed beech tree, which a turn of the path would soon reveal, and his pulses quickened and became tremulous as he wondered if Fleurette had already reached the trysting place. He abandoned all effort to continue his ballade, which, in the 3 miles he had walked from La Frenay, had not progressed beyond the middle of a tentative first stanza. His thoughts were such as would befit an ardent and impatient lover. They were now interrupted by a shrill scream that rose to an unendurable pitch of fear and horror, issuing from the green stillness of the pines beside the way. Startled, he peered at the thick branches, and as the scream fell back to silence, he heard the sound of dull and hurrying footfalls, and a scuffling as of several bodies. Again the scream arose. It was plainly the voice of a woman in some distressful peril. Loosening his dagger in its sheath, and clutching more firmly a long hornbeam staff which he had brought with him as a protection against the vipers which were said to lurk in Averoigne, he plunged without hesitation or premeditation among the low-hanging boughs from which the voice had seemed to emerge. In a small open space beyond the trees, he saw a woman who was struggling with 3 ruffians of exceptionally brutal and evil aspect. Even in the haste and vehemence of the moment, Gerard realized that he had never before seen such men or such a woman. The woman was clad in a gown of emerald green that matched her eyes. In her face was the pallor of dead things, together with a fairy beauty, and her lips were dyed as with the scarlet of newly flowing blood. The men were dark as Moors, and their eyes were red slits of flame beneath oblique brows with animal-like bristles. There was something very peculiar in the shape of their feet, but Gerard did not realize the exact nature of the peculiarity till long afterwards. Then he remembered that all of them were seemingly club-footed, though they were able to move with surpassing agility. Somehow, he could never recall what sort of clothing they had worn. The woman turned a beseeching gaze upon Gerard as he sprang forth from amid the boughs. The men, however, did not seem to heed his coming, though one of them caught in a hairy clutch the hands which the woman sought to reach toward her rescuer. Lifting his staff, Gerard rushed upon the ruffians. He struck a tremendous blow at the head of the nearest one, a blow that should have leveled the fellow to earth. But the staff came down on unresisting air, and Gerard staggered and almost fell headlong in trying to recover his equilibrium. Dazed and uncomprehending, he saw that the knot of struggling figures had vanished utterly. At least, the three men had vanished. But from the middle branches of a tall pine beyond the open space, the death-white features of the woman smiled upon him for a moment with faint, inscrutable guile ere they melted among the needles. Chapter 2. Gerard understood now, and he shivered as he crossed himself. He had been deluded by phantoms or demons, doubtless for no good purpose. He had been the gull of a questionable enchantment. Plainly, there was something after all in the legends he had heard, in the ill renown of the forest of Averoigne. He retraced his way toward the path he had been following. But when he thought to reach again the spot from which he had heard that shrill, unearthly scream, he saw that there was no longer a path, nor, indeed, any feature of the forest which he could remember or recognize. The foliage about him no longer displayed a brilliant verdure. It was sad and funereal, and the trees themselves were either cypress-like or were already sere with autumn or decay. In lieu of the purling brook, there lay before him a tarn of waters that were dark and dull as clotting blood, and which gave back no reflection of the brown autumnal sedges that trailed therein like the hair of suicides, and the skeletons of rotting osiers that writhed above them. Now, beyond all question, Gerard knew that he was the victim of an evil enchantment. In answering that beguileful cry for succor, he had exposed himself to the spell, had been lured within the circle of its power. He could not know what forces of wizardry or demonry had willed to draw him thus, but he knew that his situation was fraught with supernatural menace. He gripped the hornbeam staff more tightly in his hand and prayed to all the saints he could remember as he peered about for some tangible bodily presence of ill. The scene was utterly desolate and lifeless, like a place where cadavers might keep their tryst with demons. Nothing stirred, not even a dead leaf, and there was no whisper of dry grass or foliage, no song of birds nor murmuring of bees, no sigh nor chuckle of water. The corpse-gray heavens above seemed never to have held a sun, and the chill, unchanging light was without source or destination, without beams or shadows. Gerard surveyed his environment with a cautious eye, and the more he looked, the less he liked it, for some new and disagreeable detail was manifest at every glance. There were moving lights in the wood that vanished if he eyed them intently. There were drowned faces in the tarn that came and went like livid bubbles before he could discern their features. And, peering across the lake, he wondered why he had not seen the many-turreted castle of hoary stone whose nearer walls were based in the dead waters. It was so gray and still and vasty that it seemed to have stood for incomputable ages between the stagnant tarn and the equally stagnant heavens. It was ancienter than the world. It was older than the light. It was coeval with fear and darkness, and a horror dwelt upon it and crept unseen but palpable along its bastions. There was no sign of life about the castle, and no banners flew above its turrets or its donjon. But Gerard knew, as surely as if a voice had spoken aloud to warn him, that here was the fountainhead of the sorcery by which he had been beguiled. A growing panic whispered in his brain. He seemed to hear the rustle of malignant plumes, the mutter of demonian threats and plottings. He turned and fled among the funereal trees. Amid his dismay and wilderment, even as he fled, he thought of Fleurette, and wondered if she were awaiting him at their place of rendezvous, or if she and her companions had also been enticed and led astray in a realm of damnable unrealities. He renewed his prayers and implored the saints for her safety as well as his own. The forest through which he ran was a maze of bafflement and eeriness. There were no landmarks, there were no tracks of animals or men, and the swart cypresses and sere autumnal trees grew thicker and thicker, as if some malevolent will were marshalling them against his progress. The boughs were like implacable arms that strove to retard him. He could have sworn that he felt them twine about him with the strength and suppleness of living things. He fought them insanely, desperately, and seemed to hear a crackling of infernal laughter in their twigs as he fought. At last, with a sob of relief, he broke through into a sort of trail. Along this trail, in the mad hope of eventual escape, he ran like one whom a fiend pursues, and after a short interval, he came again to the shores of the Tarn, above whose motionless waters the high and hoary turrets of that time-forgotten castle were still dominant. Again he turned and fled, and once more, after similar wanderings and like struggles, he came back to the inevitable Tarn. With a leaden sinking of his heart, as into some ultimate slough of despair and terror, he resigned himself and made no further effort to escape. His very will was benumbed, was crushed down as by the incumbents of a superior volition that would no longer permit his puny recalcitrance. He was unable to resist when a strong and hateful compulsion drew his footsteps along the margin of the Tarn toward the looming castle. When he came nearer, he saw that the edifice was surrounded by a moat whose waters were stagnant as those of the lake, and were mantled with the iridescent scum of corruption. The drawbridge was down and the gates were open, as if to receive an expected guest. But still there was no sign of human occupancy, and the walls of the great gray building were silent as those of a sepulchre. And more tomb-like even than the rest was the square and overtowering bulk of the mighty donjon. Chapter 3. Impelled by the same power that had drawn him along the lake shore, Gerard crossed the drawbridge and passed beneath the frowning barbican into a vacant courtyard. Barred windows looked blankly down, and at the opposite end of the court a door stood mysteriously open, revealing a dark hall. As he approached the doorway, he saw that a man was standing on the threshold, though a moment previous he could have sworn that it was untenanted by any visible form. Gerard had retained his hornbeam staff, and though his reason told him that such a weapon was futile against any supernatural foe, some obscure instinct prompted him to clasp it valiantly as he neared the waiting figure on the sill. The man was inordinately tall and cadaverous, and was dressed in black garments of a superannuate mode. His lips were strangely red amid his bluish beard and the mortuary whiteness of his face. They were like the lips of the woman who, with her assailants, had disappeared in a manner so dubious when Gerard had approached them. His eyes were pale and luminous as marsh lights, and Gerard shuddered at his gaze and at the cold, ironic smile of his scarlet lips that seemed to reserve a world of secrets all too dreadful and hideous to be disclosed. "I am the Sieur du Malembois," the man announced. His tones were both unctuous and hollow, and served to increase the repugnance felt by the young troubadour. And when his lips parted, Gerard had a glimpse of teeth that were unnaturally small and were pointed like the fangs of some fierce animal. "Fortune has willed that you should become my guest," the man went on. "The hospitality which I can proffer you is rough and inadequate, and it may be that you will find my abode a trifle dismal. But at least I can assure you of a welcome no less ready than sincere." "I thank you for your kind offer," said Gerard, "but I have an appointment with a friend, and I seem in some unaccountable manner to have lost my way. I should be profoundly grateful if you would direct me toward Vaillon's. There should be a path not far from here, and I have been so stupid as to stray from it." The words rang empty and hopeless in his own ears, even as he uttered them, and the name that his strange host had given the Sieur du Malembois was haunting his mind like the funereal accents of a knell, though he could not recall at that moment the macabre and spectral ideas which the name tended to evoke. "Unfortunately, there are no paths from my Chateau de Vaillon's," the stranger replied. "As for your rendezvous, it will be kept in another manner, at another place, than the one appointed. I must therefore insist that you accept my hospitality. Enter, I pray, but leave your hornbeam staff at the door. You will have no need of it any longer." Gerard thought that he made a moue of distaste and aversion with his over-red lips as he spoke the last sentences, and that his eyes lingered on the staff with an obscure apprehensiveness. And the strange emphasis of his words and demeanor served to awaken other phantasmal and macabre thoughts in Gerard's brain, though he could not formulate them fully till afterwards. And somehow he was prompted to retain the weapon, no matter how useless it might be against an enemy of spectral or diabolic nature. So he said, "I must crave your indulgence if I retain the staff. I have made a vow to carry it with me, in my right hand or never beyond arm's reach, till I have slain 2 vipers." "That is a queer vow," rejoined his host. "However, bring it with you if you like. It is of no matter to me if you choose to encumber yourself with a wooden stick." He turned abruptly, motioning Gerard to follow him. The troubadour obeyed unwillingly, with one rearward glance at the vacant heavens and the empty courtyard. He saw with no great surprise that a sudden and furtive darkness had closed in upon the chateau without moon or star, as if it had been merely waiting for him to enter before it descended. It was thick as the folds of a cerecloth. It was airless and stifling like the gloom of a sepulchre that has been sealed for ages. And Gerard was aware of a veritable oppression, a corporeal and psychic difficulty in breathing as he crossed the threshold. He saw that cressets were now burning in the dim hall to which his host had admitted him, though he had not perceived the time and agency of their lighting. The illumination they afforded was singularly vague and indistinct, and the thronging shadows of the hall were unexplainably numerous, and moved with a mysterious disquiet, though the flames themselves were still as tapers that burn for the dead in a windless vault. At the end of the passage, the Sieur du Malembois flung open a heavy door of dark and somber wood. Beyond, in what was plainly the eating room of the chateau, several people were seated about a long table by the light of cressets no less dreary and dismal than those in the hall. In the strange, uncertain glow, their faces were touched with a gloomy dubiety, with a lurid distortion, and it seemed to Gerard that shadows hardly distinguishable from the figures were gathered around the board. But nevertheless he recognized the woman in emerald green who had vanished in so doubtful a fashion amid the pines when Gerard answered her call for succor. At one side, looking very pale and forlorn and frightened, was Fleurette Cochon. At the lower end, reserved for retainers and inferiors, there sat the maid and the manservant who had accompanied Fleurette to her rendezvous with Gerard. The Sieur du Malembois turned to the troubadour with a smile of sardonic amusement. "I believe you have already met everyone assembled," he observed, "but you have not yet been formally presented to my wife, Agathe, who is presiding over the board. Agathe, I bring to you Gerard de l'Automne, a young troubadour of much note and merit." The woman nodded slightly, without speaking, and pointed to a chair opposite Fleurette. Gerard seated himself, and the Sieur du Malembois assumed, according to feudal custom, a place at the head of the table beside his wife. Now, for the first time, Gerard noticed that there were servitors who came and went in the room, setting upon the table various wines and viands. The servitors were preternaturally swift and noiseless, and somehow it was very difficult to be sure of their precise features or their costumes. They seemed to walk in an adumbration of sinister, insoluble twilight. But the troubadour was disturbed by a feeling that they resembled the swart demoniac ruffians who had disappeared together with the woman in green when he approached them. Chapter 4. The meal that ensued was a weird and funereal affair. A sense of insuperable constraint, of smothering horror and hideous oppression was upon Gerard, and though he wanted to ask Fleurette 100 questions and also demand an explanation of sundry matters from his host and hostess, he was totally unable to frame the words or to utter them. He could only look at Fleurette and read in her eyes a duplication of his own helpless bewilderment and nightmare thraldom. Nothing was said by the Sieur de Malembois and his lady, who were exchanging glances of a secret and baleful intelligence all through the meal, and Fleurette's maid and manservant were obviously paralyzed by terror, like birds beneath the hypnotic gaze of deadly serpents. The foods were rich and of strange savor, and the wines were fabulously old, and seemed to retain in their topaz or violet depths the unextinguished fire of buried centuries. But Gerard and Fleurette could barely touch them, and they saw that the Sieur du Malembois and his lady did not eat or drink at all. The gloom of the chamber deepened. The servitors became more furtive and spectral in their movements. The stifling air was laden with unformulable menace, was constrained by the spell of a black and lethal necromancy. Above the aromas of the rare foods, the bouquets of the antique wines, there crept forth the choking mustiness of hidden vaults and embalmed centurial corruption, together with the ghostly spice of a strange perfume that seemed to emanate from the person of the chatelaine. And now Gerard was remembering many tales from the legendary of Averoigne, which he had heard and disregarded, was recalling the story of a Sieur du Malembois and his lady, the last of the name and the most evil, who had been buried somewhere in this forest hundreds of years ago, and whose tomb was shunned by the peasantry, since they were said to continue their sorceries even in death. He wondered what influence had bedrugged his memory, that he had not recalled it wholly when he had first heard the name. And he was remembering other things and other stories, all of which confirmed his instinctive belief regarding the nature of the people into whose hands he had fallen. Also, he recalled a folklore superstition concerning the use to which a wooden stake can be put, and realized why the Sieur du Malembois had shown a peculiar interest in the hornbeam staff. Gerard had laid the staff beside his chair when he sat down, and he was reassured to find that it had not vanished. Very quietly and unobtrusively, he placed his foot upon it. The uncanny meal came to an end, and the host and his chatelaine arose. "I shall now conduct you to your rooms," said the Sieur du Malembois, including all of his guests in a dark, inscrutable glance. "Each of you can have a separate chamber if you so desire, or Fleurette Cochin and her maid Angelique can remain together, and the manservant Raoul can sleep in the same room with Monsieur Gerard." A preference for the latter procedure was voiced by Fleurette and the troubadour. The thought of uncompanioned solitude in that castle of timeless midnight and nameless mystery was abhorrent to an insupportable degree. The four were now led to their respective chambers, on opposite sides of a hall whose length was but indeterminately revealed by the dismal lights. Fleurette and Gerard bade each other a dismayed and reluctant good night beneath the constraining eye of their host. Their rendezvous was hardly the one which they had thought to keep, and both were overwhelmed by the supernatural situation, amid whose dubious horrors and ineluctable sorceries they had somehow become involved. And no sooner had Gerard left Fleurette than he began to curse himself for a poltroon because he had not refused to part from her side, and he marveled at the spell of drug-like involution that had bed-roused all his faculties. It seemed that his will was not his own, but had been thrust down and throttled by an alien power. The room assigned to Gerard and Raoul was furnished with a couch and a great bed whose curtains were of antique fashion and fabric. It was lighted with tapers that had a funereal suggestion in their form, and which burned dully in an air that was stagnant with the mustiness of dead years. "May you sleep soundly," said the Sieur du Malembois. The smile that accompanied and followed the words was no less unpleasant than the oily and sepulchral tone in which they were uttered. The troubadour and the servant were conscious of profound relief when he went out and closed the leaden clanging door, and their relief was hardly diminished even when they heard the click of a key in the lock. Chapter 5. Gerard was now inspecting the room, and he went to the one window, through whose small and deep-set panes he could see only the pressing darkness of a night that was veritably solid, as if the whole place were buried beneath the earth and were closed in by clinging mold. Then, with an access of unsmothered rage at his separation from Fleurette, he ran to the door and hurled himself against it. He beat upon it with his clenched fists, but in vain. Realizing his folly and desisting at last, he turned to Raoul. "Well, Raoul," he said, "what do you think of all this?" Raoul crossed himself before he answered, and his face had assumed the visard of a mortal fear. "I think, monsieur," he finally replied, "that we have all been decoyed by a malefic sorcery, and that you, myself, the demoiselle Fleurette, and the maid Angelique are all in deadly peril of both soul and body." "That also is my thought," said Gerard. and I believe it would be well that you and I should sleep only by turns, and that he who keeps vigil should retain in his hands my hornbeam staff, whose end I shall now sharpen with my dagger. I am sure that you know the manner in which it should be employed if there are any intruders, for if such should come, there would be no doubt as to their character and their intentions. We are in a castle which has no legitimate existence, as the guests of people who have been dead, or supposedly dead, for more than 200 years. And such people, when they stir abroad, are prone to habits which I need not specify. Yes, monsieur, Raoul shuddered, but he watched the sharpening of the staff with considerable interest. Gerard whittled the hard wood to a lance-like point and hid the shavings carefully. He even carved the outline of a little cross near the middle of the staff, thinking that this might increase its efficacy or save it from molestation. Then, with the staff in his hand, he sat down upon the bed, where he could survey the litten room from between the curtains. "You can sleep first, Raoul." He indicated the couch, which was near the door. The two conversed in a fitful manner for some minutes. After hearing Raoul's tale of how Fleurette, Angelique, and himself had been led astray by the sobbing of a woman amid the pines and had been unable to retrace their way, the troubadour changed the theme, and henceforth he spoke idly and of matters remote from his real preoccupations, to fight down his torturing concern for the safety of Fleurette. Suddenly he became aware that Raoul had ceased to reply, and saw that the servant had fallen asleep on the couch. At the same time, an irresistible drowsiness surged upon Gerard himself, in spite of all his volition, in spite of the eldritch terrors and forebodings that still murmured in his brain. He heard through his growing hebetude a whisper as of shadowy wings in the castle halls. He caught the sibilation of ominous voices, like those of familiars that respond to the summoning of wizards, and he seemed to hear, even in the vaults and towers and remote chambers, the tread of feet that were hurrying on malign and secret errands. But oblivion was around him like the meshes of a sable net, and it closed in relentlessly upon his troubled mind and drowned the alarms of his agitated senses. Chapter 6. When Gerard awoke at length, the tapers had burned to their sockets, and a sad and sunless daylight was filtering through the window. The staff was still in his hand, and though his senses were still dull with the strange slumber that had drugged them, he felt that he was unharmed. But peering between the curtains, he saw that Raoul was lying mortally pale and lifeless on the couch, with the air and look of an exhausted moribund. He crossed the room and stooped above the servant. There was a small red wound on Raoul's neck, and his pulses were slow and feeble, like those of one who has lost a great amount of blood. His very appearance was withered and vein-drawn, and a phantom spice arose from the couch, a lingering wraith of the perfume worn by the Châtelaine Agathe. Gerard succeeded at last in arousing the man, but Raoul was very weak and drowsy. He could remember nothing of what had happened during the night, and his horror was pitiful to behold when he realized the truth. "It will be your turn next, monsieur," he cried. "These vampires mean to hold us here amid their unhallowed necromancies till they have drained us of our last drop of blood. Their spells are like mandragora or the sleepy syrups of Cathay, and no man can keep awake in their despite." Gerard was trying the door, and somewhat to his surprise, he found it unlocked. The departing vampire had been careless in the lethargy of her repletion. The castle was very still, and it seemed to Gerard that the animating spirit of evil was now quiescent, that the shadowy wings of horror and malignity, the feet that had sped on baleful errands, the summoning sorcerers, the responding familiars, were all lulled in a temporary slumber. He opened the door, he tiptoed along the deserted hall, and knocked at the portal of the chamber allotted to Fleurette and her maid. Fleurette, fully dressed, answered his knock immediately, and he caught her in his arms without a word, searching her wan face with a tender anxiety. Over her shoulder he could see the maid Angelique, who was sitting listlessly on the bed with a mark on her white neck, similar to the wound that had been suffered by Raoul. He knew, even before Fleurette began to speak, that the nocturnal experiences of the demoiselle and her maid had been identical with those of himself and the manservant. While he tried to comfort Fleurette and reassure her, his thoughts were now busy with a rather curious problem. No one was abroad in the castle, and it was more than probable that the Sieur du Malembois and his lady were both asleep after the nocturnal feast which they had undoubtedly enjoyed. Gerard pictured to himself the place and the fashion of their slumber, and he grew even more reflective as certain possibilities occurred to him. "Be of good cheer, sweetheart," he said to Fleurette. "It is in my mind that we may soon escape from this abominable mesh of enchantments. But I must leave you for a little and speak again with Raoul, whose help I shall require in a certain matter." He went back to his own chamber. The manservant was sitting on the couch and was crossing himself feebly and muttering prayers with a faint, hollow voice. "Raoul," said the troubadour a little sternly, "you must gather all your strength and come with me. Amid the gloomy walls that surround us, the somber ancient halls, the high towers, and the heavy bastions, there is but one thing that veritably exists, and all the rest is a fabric of illusion. We must find the reality whereof I speak, and deal with it like true and valiant Christians. Come, we will now search the castle ere the lord and chatelaine shall awaken from their vampire lethargy." He led the way along the devious corridors with a swiftness that betokened much forethought. He had reconstructed in his mind the hoary pile of battlements and turrets as he had seen them on the previous day, and he felt that the great donjon, being the center and stronghold of the edifice, might well be the place which he sought. With the sharpened staff in his hand, with Raoul lagging bloodlessly at his heels, he passed the doors of many secret rooms, the many windows that gave on the blindness of an inner court, and came at last to the lower story of the donjon keep. It was a large bare room, entirely built of stone, and illumined only by narrow slits high up in the wall that had been designed for the use of archers. The place was very dim, but Gerard could see the glimmering outlines of an object not ordinarily to be looked for in such a situation, that arose from the middle of the floor. It was a tomb of marble, and stepping nearer, he saw that it was strangely weather-worn and was blotched by lichens of gray and yellow, such as flourish only within access of the sun. The slab that covered it was doubly broad and massive, and would require the full strength of 2 men to lift. Raoul was staring stupidly at the tomb. "What now, monsieur?" he queried. "You and I, Raoul, are about to intrude upon the bedchamber of our host and hostess." At his direction, Raoul seized one end of the slab, and he himself took the other. With a mighty effort that strained their bones and sinews to the cracking point, they sought to remove it, but the slab hardly stirred. At length, by grasping the same end in unison, they were able to tilt the slab, and it slid away and dropped to the floor with a thunderous crash. Within there were 2 open coffins, one of which contained the Sieur Hugh du Malembois and the other his lady Agathe. Both of them appeared to be slumbering peacefully as infants. A look of tranquil evil, of pacified malignity, was imprinted upon their features, and their lips were dyed with a fresher scarlet than before. Without hesitation or delay, Gerard plunged the lance-like end of his staff into the bosom of the Sieur du Malembois. The body crumbled as if it were wrought of ashes kneaded and painted to human semblance, and a slight odor as of age-old corruption arose to the nostrils of Gerard. Then the troubadour pierced in like manner the bosom of the chatelaine. And simultaneously with her dissolution, the walls and floor of the donjon seemed to dissolve like a sullen vapor. They rolled away on every side with a shock as of unheard thunder. With a sense of weird vertigo and confusion, Gerard and Raoul saw that the whole chateau had vanished like the towers and battlements of a bygone storm, that the dead lake and its rotting shores no longer offered their malefical illusions to the eye. They were standing in a forest glade, in the full, unshadowed light of the afternoon sun, and all that remained of the dismal castle was the lichen-mantled tomb that stood open beside them. Fleurette and her maid were a little distance away, and Gerard ran to the mercer's daughter and took her in his arms. She was dazed with wonderment, like one who emerges from the night-long labyrinth of an evil dream and finds that all is well. "I think, sweetheart," said Gerard, "that our next rendezvous will not be interrupted by the Sieur du Malembois and his chatelaine." But Fleurette was still bemused with wonder and could only respond to his words with a kiss. The end.